George Cleary rejected a poor cafeteria worker on a rainy rooftop, called her not for his world, and forgot her name by morning, while she lost everything that same night and slept in an alley for 3 weeks. Fast forward 3 years, she's a billionaire CEO walking into his boardroom, and she just became his boss by secretly buying 28% of his failing company. The moment he recognized her face, his empire started crumbling, and what she did next made every news outlet in the world stop and stare. George Cleary, billionaire CEO. The man whose face covered business magazines and skyscraper billboards. Tall, polished, powerful, he moved like someone who owned every street he walked on. Even in the rain, his designer suit looked perfect, his shoes gleaming, his dark hair slicked back like he'd just stepped out of a photo shoot. Annie hugged her thin coat tighter, the only one she owned, soaked through, offering no protection from the storm. Her cafeteria uniform clung to her skin underneath. She knew how she looked, pathetic. A drowned rat standing in front of a lion. But she'd come this far. She couldn't stop now. Annie. George turned when he heard her footsteps, his voice smooth and controlled. What are you doing up here? It's dangerous in this weather. For just a second, she thought she saw something soft in his eyes. Something warm. It vanished so quickly she wondered if she'd imagined it. I needed to talk to you, she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. George's expression shifted. Cautious. Guarded. About what? Annie's heart hammered. This was it. The moment she'd rehearsed 1,000 times in her tiny basement apartment, lying awake on her mattress on the floor, staring at the ceiling and imagining what it would be like if someone like George Cleary could love someone like her. About us, she whispered. The words hung in the air between them, fragile as glass. Then George's face changed, and Annie watched every dream she'd ever had shatter in real time. Welcome back, my strong family and friends, to Mr. Crown Stories. If no one told you today, hear this, you are enough. You are worthy. You are the light that fights back when the world tries to dim you. I make these stories for hearts like yours, hearts that have been broken by rejection, crushed by cruelty, yet refuse to stay down. If this story touches your soul, click subscribe, drop I'm here in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from, because tomorrow brings another powerful story of transformation, and you don't want to miss it. Every word I write is for you, the one who was told you weren't good enough, yet rose anyway. May your heart find hope, your struggles find solutions, and your spirit shine brighter with each new dawn. Let's walk this journey together, hand in hand, heart to heart. Now, let us begin. The warmth drained from George's eyes, replaced by something cold and distant. He took a step back, and that single movement felt like a wall slamming down between them. Annie. He said her name like it was a burden. There is no us. The world tilted. I thought, she couldn't finish. Her throat closed up, choking on words that suddenly felt stupid and childish. You thought what? George's voice was firmer now, almost irritated. That because I was kind to you, because I asked about your day a few times, that meant something more? Each word was a knife. We're from different worlds, Annie. You work in the cafeteria. I run a billion-dollar company. He gestured between them, dismissive, final. This could never happen. You're not for my world. The rain pounded harder. Or maybe that was just the sound of her heart breaking into pieces too small to ever put back together. Annie stared at him, unable to speak, unable to breathe. She'd known this was possible. She'd known the odds were against her. But hearing it out loud, seeing the way he looked at her now, like she was something beneath him, something inconvenient, it destroyed her in ways she didn't know were possible. I'm sorry if I gave you the wrong impression, George continued, his tone softening slightly, which somehow made it worse. You're a sweet girl, Annie. You deserve someone appropriate. Someone in your league. Someone in your league. The words echoed in her skull like a death sentence. Annie didn't remember deciding to run. Her body just moved, stumbling backward, then turning, her shoes slipping on the wet concrete. She heard George call her name once, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her vision blurred as she crashed through the rooftop door and down the stairs. From rain or tears, she didn't know anymore. Past the executive floor she'd never belonged on. Past security guards who looked at her like she was a stain. Through the lobby where marble floors reflected her pathetic, soaked silhouette. The revolving doors spun her out into the street, and the storm swallowed her whole. Annie walked without direction, without purpose. Her chest heaved with sobs she couldn't control. People with umbrellas hurried past, dodging her like she was invisible. She probably was. To them. To George. To everyone. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. With shaking hands, she pulled it out. The screen was cracked, had been for months, but she could still read the email notification that glowed like a final punch to the gut. Subject: Employment Termination Notice. Dear Ms. Sander, due to recent budget restructuring, your position as junior cafeteria staff has been eliminated effective immediately. Please return your employee badge to HR by end of business day Friday. Annie stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the sidewalk as rain hammered down, as people pushed past her, as cars splashed through puddles that soaked her already ruined shoes. She'd lost him. She'd lost her job. She'd lost everything in the span of 15 minutes. Her knees buckled, and she sank down onto the curb, pulling her knees to her chest, staring at the city lights that blurred through her tears and the rain. The world kept moving around her, honking horns, shouting voices, the hiss of tires on wet pavement, but Annie felt frozen. Erased. She was nobody. She had nothing. And George Cleary's voice echoed in her mind like a curse, "You're not for my world." The hours that followed were a haze. Annie sat in that same spot until her body went numb from the cold. She watched the rain slow to a drizzle, then stop entirely. She watched the sky lighten from black to gray. She watched people start their mornings, coffee cups in hand, briefcases swinging, lives full of purpose and direction. She had none of that. When her legs finally obeyed her again, she stood and walked toward the only place she could think of, the tiny basement apartment she rented in a building that smelled like mold and broken dreams. But when she arrived, there was an eviction notice taped to her door. Of course. Annie laughed, a bitter broken sound that scared even her. She'd been late on rent twice. The landlord had warned her. This was inevitable. She didn't have the energy to cry anymore. She just stood there, staring at the yellow paper fluttering slightly in the breeze, and felt the last piece of her old life crumble into dust. The narrow alley behind the abandoned grocery store became Annie's home. Not by choice. By necessity. For 3 weeks, she lived on the streets. Slept on cardboard. Used public restrooms to wash her face. Ate from dollar menus when she had coins. Most days, she didn't eat at all. The city that once sparkled with possibility now felt like a prison designed specifically to torture her. She applied to 47 jobs in the first week. Every single one rejected her. No references. No permanent address. No clean clothes for interviews. No hope. By the second week, she stopped trying. By the third week, she stopped caring. Annie Sander, the girl who once dreamed of escaping poverty, who'd worked 3 jobs while finishing high school, who'd believed that hard work and determination could overcome anything, that girl was gone. What remained was a hollow shell sitting in an alley, knees pulled to chest, staring at nothing. She thought about George constantly. Not because she still loved him, that had died the moment he looked at her like she was trash, but because his words had carved themselves into her soul. "You're not for my world." Maybe he was right. Maybe she wasn't for anyone's world. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple that felt cruelly beautiful, Annie overheard 2 voices nearby. 2 men in expensive suits stood outside the coffee shop across the street, talking loud enough that their voices carried to where she sat hidden in shadow. "Did you see the announcement?" one said. "The Global Women's Empowerment Foundation is offering full scholarships again." "Yeah, for female entrepreneurs, right?" the other replied. "All expenses paid. 3-year program abroad. They're targeting women from disadvantaged backgrounds." Smart PR move. Some of those women actually succeed. Remember that girl from Brazil who started the Clean Water Initiative? She was homeless before the program. Their voices faded as they walked away, but Annie's heart, dormant for weeks, suddenly jolted back to life. A scholarship. For women from disadvantaged backgrounds. She looked down at herself, filthy clothes, unwashed hair, bruised knees from sleeping on concrete. If that didn't qualify as disadvantaged, nothing did. For the first time in weeks, Annie Sander stood up. She walked to the public library, her only sanctuary, and used one of the free computers. Her hands shook as she typed Global Women's Empowerment Foundation Scholarship into the search bar. The application was extensive. Education history. Personal statement. References. Future goals. Annie stared at the blank fields for a long moment. She had no impressive education. No references. No clear future. But she had a story. And she had something else, something that had been building inside her chest for 3 weeks, growing hotter and stronger with every hungry night, every cold morning, every memory of George's disgusted face. Rage. Pure, burning, unstoppable rage at a world that kept telling her she didn't belong. Annie placed her fingers on the keyboard and started typing. My name is Annie Sander. I am currently homeless. I lost everything because someone told me I wasn't good enough for his world. I'm applying for this scholarship because I refuse to believe him. I refuse to believe that where you start determines where you end. I refuse to disappear. She wrote for 2 hours, pouring every ounce of pain and determination into that application. She wrote about growing up in foster care after her parents died. About working since she was 16. About the billionaire who rejected her and the night she lost everything. She didn't sugarcoat it. She didn't make herself sound noble or inspiring. She just told the truth, raw, ugly, and real. When she finally hit submit, her entire body trembled. Then Annie Sander walked back to her alley, curled up on her cardboard bed, and cried, not from sadness this time, but from something else. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. If this story has gripped your heart so far, could you live with yourself knowing you didn't take 2 seconds to subscribe and comment below? What would you have done if someone shattered your dreams like this? Would you have given up, or would you have fought back? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next in Annie's unbelievable transformation. 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks of sleeping on bus stop benches until security guards chased her away at midnight. 2 weeks of skipping meals because the $3 in her pocket had to last. 2 weeks of watching the world move forward while she stayed frozen in place, invisible and forgotten. Annie learned things about survival she'd never wanted to know. She learned that the McDonald's on 5th Street threw away perfectly good food at closing time if you waited in the right spot behind the dumpster. She learned that the 24-hour laundromat had a bathroom where she could wash her face and armpits without anyone bothering her. She learned that if you kept your head down and stayed quiet, most people would look right through you like you didn't exist. And she learned that hunger wasn't just an empty stomach, it was an ache that lived in your bones, a constant companion that made everything harder. Walking hurt. Thinking hurt. Existing hurt. But nothing hurt more than the hope she'd killed inside herself. Because hope was dangerous. Hope was the thing that had led her to that rooftop. Hope was what George Cleary had crushed under his designer shoes when he looked at her like she was nothing. So Annie stopped hoping. She just survived. One morning, Annie sat on a bench at the bus station, watching commuters rush past with their coffee cups and smartphones and lives that made sense. She was so tired. Not just physically, though her body ached from sleeping on hard surfaces. She was tired in her soul, the kind of exhausted that made you wonder if it was worth waking up tomorrow. That's when she saw it. A discarded magazine on the bench beside her. Fortune Business Weekly. The cover was slightly crumpled, coffee stained on one corner, but the image was crystal clear. George Cleary's face smiled back at her. The headline screamed in bold letters, Billionaire CEO expands empire, George Cleary's $3 billion merger shakes industry. Annie's breath caught in her throat. She picked up the magazine with trembling hands, staring at his photograph. He looked exactly the same as he had on that rooftop. Polished, powerful, untouchable. His suit probably cost more than she'd made in her entire life. His smile was confident, the smile of a man who'd never known what it felt like to be hungry, to be rejected, to be nothing. The article gushed about his success, his strategic brilliance, his vision for the future, his philanthropy. Apparently, he'd just donated $500,000 to some children's charity. $500,000. Annie looked down at her own hands, dirty, calloused, shaking slightly from hunger. She looked at her shoes with holes in the soles. Her coat that barely kept the cold out. Her reflection in a nearby window that showed a ghost of the girl she used to be. While she starved in a bus station, George Cleary was merging empires and posing for magazine covers. The injustice of it hit her like a physical blow. He'd rejected her, fired her company had fired her the same night, and now he was being celebrated while she fought to survive each day. He probably didn't even remember her name. She was nothing to him, a brief inconvenience, a poor girl who'd embarrassed herself, already forgotten. Annie's hands clenched around the magazine, crumpling George's perfect smile. Then she threw it in the trash and walked away, her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. She wouldn't cry over him. Not anymore. Never again. 3 days later, Annie was sitting in her usual spot in the alley behind the grocery store when she heard voices approaching. 2 men in expensive suits walked past the alley entrance, their conversation carrying clearly in the evening air. "Did you see the announcement?" one of them said, adjusting his briefcase. "Which one?" the other replied, checking his phone. "The Global Women's Empowerment Foundation. They're offering those full scholarships again, the 3-year entrepreneurship program." Annie's head lifted slightly, her attention caught despite herself. "Oh right," the second man said. "All expenses paid, international program. They target women from disadvantaged backgrounds, right?" "Exactly. It's actually pretty impressive. They take women who've had nothing, poverty, homelessness, abuse, and train them to become business leaders. Full ride, housing, education, meals, everything." "Does it actually work?" "Apparently. Remember that woman from Brazil? Started a clean water company after the program, now she's worth millions. And there was that girl from Detroit who built an education app, she was homeless before the scholarship." The first man laughed. "From homeless to millionaire. That's the American dream, except it's not even American. Global dream, I guess. Applications close next week, I think." Their voices faded as they turned the corner, leaving Annie alone in the alley with a feeling she'd thought was dead. Hope. Dangerous, terrifying, impossible hope. Annie sat frozen for several minutes, her heart pounding against her ribs. A scholarship. For women from disadvantaged backgrounds. For women like her. No, she told herself. Don't be stupid. You already lost everything trying to reach for things you can't have. But the voice in her head, quieter but persistent, whispered back, what if? What if this was her chance? What if this was the door that was meant to open? What if George Cleary rejecting her wasn't the end of her story, but the beginning? Before she could talk herself out of it, Annie stood up and walked toward the public library. The library was warm and smelled like old books and possibility. Annie slipped inside, ignoring the way the security guard's eyes followed her, probably wondering if she was homeless. She was, but that wasn't his business. She found an empty computer in the back corner and sat down, her hands hovering over the keyboard. She typed slowly, Global Women's Empowerment Foundation Scholarship. The website loaded, clean and professional, with photos of smiling women in graduation gowns and business suits. Women who looked confident and powerful, everything Annie wasn't. She clicked on Apply Now. The application was long. Really long. Personal information. Educational background. Work history. Personal statement. Goals and aspirations. 3 essay questions. Annie stared at the blank fields, feeling the hope drain out of her as quickly as it had appeared. What was she thinking? She had no college degree. Her work history was a list of dead-end jobs she'd been fired from or quit. Her personal statement would be, I'm homeless and desperate. This was stupid. She moved the cursor to close the tab. Then she stopped. George's face flashed in her mind, that magazine cover, that smile, those words, you're not for my world. Annie's jaw clenched. Her fingers moved back to the keyboard. And she started typing. My name is Annie Sander. I am 22 years old, and I am currently homeless. She paused, then kept going. 4 weeks ago, I lost my job and my apartment on the same night. I have been living on the streets ever since. I have no family, no support system, and no money. By every measurable standard, I am a failure. But I refuse to believe that this is where my story ends. I grew up in foster care after my parents died when I was 12. I worked 3 jobs to finish high school. I have scrubbed floors, delivered packages, served food, and done whatever it took to survive. I have been told my entire life that people like me don't matter. That we're not good enough. That we should accept our place and stop dreaming above our station. I am applying for this scholarship because I refuse to accept that. I don't have connections or credentials or impressive resume. What I have is hunger, not just the physical kind, though I know that intimately, but hunger to prove that where you start doesn't determine where you end. Hunger to build something that matters. Hunger to show the world that people like me are worth investing in. If you give me this chance, I will not waste it. I will work harder than anyone else in the program. I will absorb every lesson, seize every opportunity, and become the kind of woman who lifts others up the way this scholarship would lift me. I am not asking for pity. I am asking for a chance. Just one chance. That's all I need. Annie's vision blurred as she typed, tears streaming down her face that she didn't bother to wipe away. The words poured out of her, raw, desperate, honest, everything she'd been holding inside for weeks. When she finally finished the application 2 hours later, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely click submit. The confirmation page loaded. Thank you for your application. You will receive a response within 2 to 3 weeks. Annie stared at the screen, then dropped her head into her hands. She'd done it. She'd actually applied. And now she had to wait. The waiting was torture. Annie checked her email every single day at the library, refreshing the page obsessively even though she knew responses took weeks. The librarian started recognizing her, nodding kindly but saying nothing. 10 days passed. Nothing. 15 days. Nothing. Annie told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she'd expected this. She told herself to stop hoping because hope only led to disappointment, and she couldn't survive another disappointment. On day 17, she almost didn't go to the library. What was the point? But something, stubbornness maybe, or that tiny spark of hope she couldn't quite kill, made her go anyway. She logged into her email, expecting nothing. And there it was. Subject: Scholarship application, accepted. Annie's heart stopped. Her hands froze on the mouse. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she was seeing. She clicked the email with trembling fingers. Dear Ms. Sander, congratulations. We are thrilled to inform you that you have been selected for the Global Women's Empowerment Foundation Scholarship Program. Your application moved our selection committee deeply. Your resilience, honesty, and determination exemplify exactly the kind of spirit this program was created to nurture. The program begins in 6 weeks at our Geneva campus. All expenses, travel, housing, education, and living stipend, will be fully covered for the 3-year duration. Please respond within 72 hours to confirm your acceptance. Welcome to your new beginning, Annie. This is your chance. Annie read it again. And again. And again. Her vision blurred completely now, tears pouring down her face so fast she couldn't see the screen anymore. She covered her mouth with both hands, trying to hold back the sob that was building in her chest, but it came anyway, a sound somewhere between crying and laughing, loud enough that people turned to look. She didn't care. Thank you, she whispered through her tears. Thank you, God. Just one chance. That's all I needed. Just one chance. Her shaking hand moved the mouse to the accept button. She clicked it. And Annie Sander, homeless, broken, rejected, felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd forgotten what it was called. She felt powerful. The plane touched down in Geneva on a crystalline morning that felt like stepping into another world. Annie pressed her face against the window, watching the Alps rise in the distance like ancient guardians, their peaks dusted with snow that glittered in the sunlight. Below, Lake Geneva stretched out like liquid sapphire, surrounded by buildings that looked like they belonged in a fairy tale, elegant, pristine, impossibly beautiful. She'd never been on a plane before 6 hours ago. She'd never left her country. She'd never imagined she'd have a reason to. As the other passengers gathered their designer luggage and checked their expensive watches, Annie clutched her single backpack, everything she owned, and felt the familiar weight of not belonging settle over her shoulders. You don't deserve this, a voice whispered in her head. They're going to figure out you're a fraud. Annie shook it off and followed the crowd toward baggage claim, where a woman holding a sign reading GWF Scholars smiled warmly at her. Welcome to Geneva, the woman said in perfect English with a slight French accent. You must be Annie Sander. Yes, Annie managed, her voice small. I'm Claire Dubois, program coordinator. Come, let's get you settled. The scholarship campus was unlike anything Annie had ever seen. Modern glass buildings overlooked the lake, with classrooms that had floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Her assigned room, private, with an actual bed, desk, and ensuite bathroom, felt like a luxury hotel compared to the alley she'd been sleeping in weeks ago. Annie sat on the bed, ran her hand over the clean white sheets, and cried. Not from sadness this time. From disbelief. From gratitude. From the terrifying realization that this was real, and she couldn't mess it up. The program began the next morning at 7 a.m. sharp. Annie walked into the lecture hall and immediately felt the difference between her and the other 23 women in the program. They came from disadvantaged backgrounds, yes, but most had at least finished high school, some had community college degrees, a few even had bachelor's degrees from their home countries. Annie had nothing but a GED and survival skills. The first week was orientation, introductions, program expectations, goal-setting workshops. Annie stayed quiet, observing, absorbing, trying not to draw attention to the fact that she understood maybe half of what the instructors were saying. Words like market capitalization, and venture capital, and scalability flew around the room like a foreign language she was supposed to already know. She took notes on everything, writing down terms she'd Google later at night when no one could see how lost she was. By week 2, the real work began. Business fundamentals. 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Professor Laurent, a former Goldman Sachs executive, explained financial statements with the assumption everyone understood basic accounting. Annie didn't. She stayed after class, asking questions until she understood. Then she went to the library and read 3 textbooks on accounting until midnight. Technology and innovation. 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. They learned about emerging tech, fintech, blockchain, AI, machine learning. Annie's classmates nodded along. Annie felt like she was drowning. So she watched YouTube tutorials until 2 a.m., teaching herself the basics everyone else already knew. Marketing and strategy. 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Case studies of successful companies, discussions of positioning and branding and customer acquisition. Annie had never taken a marketing class in her life. She studied the cases until her eyes burned, memorizing every detail, preparing for discussions like her life depended on it. Because it did. 3 weeks in, during a business strategy discussion, Professor Laurent posed a question to the class. A startup has strong product-market fit but limited capital. Do they prioritize customer acquisition or product development? Silence. Annie's hand slowly raised. Yes, Annie. Her voice shook slightly. It depends on their burn rate and runway. If they have less than 6 months of capital, they should focus on acquisition to prove revenue potential for investors. If they have 12 months or more, product development might create a stronger moat against competition. But really, she hesitated, then pushed forward. Really, they should do both on a limited scale. Split resources 70-30 acquisition to development, measure results monthly, and pivot based on data. Professor Laurent stared at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. That's exactly right. In fact, that's more nuanced than I expected from anyone at this stage. Annie's classmates turned to look at her, really look at her, for the first time. After class, 3 of them approached her. That was brilliant, said Yuki, a Japanese woman who'd survived an abusive marriage. How did you learn that? Asked Amara, who'd grown up in a Nigerian refugee camp. Annie shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. I just read a lot. What she didn't say, I read because I'm terrified of being exposed as the girl who doesn't belong here. But the studying wasn't enough to silence the demons in her head. One afternoon, during a group presentation, Annie's accent, the flat, working-class American accent she'd always had, became a target. Can you repeat that? One of the guest investors said, his tone slightly condescending. I'm having trouble understanding your pronunciation. Heat flooded Annie's face. She repeated herself, carefully enunciating each word, hating how small she felt. After the presentation, she locked herself in a bathroom stall and cried, pressing her hand over her mouth so no one would hear. You don't belong here. You're just a poor girl playing dress-up. The poverty trauma hit at unexpected moments. During a catered lunch with gourmet sandwiches and fruit, Annie found herself taking extra food and hiding it in her bag, old survival instincts she couldn't shake. When her roommate casually mentioned throwing away a slightly worn sweater, Annie felt physically ill at the waist. At night, she sometimes woke up panicking, thinking she was back in the alley, before remembering where she was. The fear of failing consumed her. What if she wasn't smart enough? What if she couldn't keep up? What if they realized they'd made a mistake accepting her, and they sent her back to nothing? 4 months into the program, Annie hit a wall. She'd been working 18-hour days, 7 days a week, surviving on coffee and anxiety. During a finance exam, her vision blurred and her hands started shaking so badly she couldn't hold her pen. She failed the exam. The first time she'd failed anything since arriving. Annie walked out of the exam room, found a quiet corner of the campus garden, and broke down completely. All the fear, all the exhaustion, all the pressure she'd been holding inside came pouring out in gasping sobs she couldn't control. Annie. She looked up, wiping her eyes quickly. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo stood there, one of the program mentors, a Nigerian woman who'd built a pharmaceutical empire from nothing. "I'm fine," Annie said automatically. "Just tired." Dr. Okonkwo sat down beside her. "You're not fine. And you're more than tired. You're burning yourself out." "I can't afford to burn out," Annie said, her voice breaking. "If I fail, I have nothing to go back to. This is my only chance." "Is that why you're working yourself to death? Because you're terrified?" Annie nodded, unable to speak. Dr. Okonkwo was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what I see when I look at you?" Annie shook her head. "I see myself 20 years ago. Refugee camp kid who got a scholarship and spent every day convinced they'd figure out I didn't belong." She smiled sadly. "I worked until I collapsed. Literally. Ended up in the hospital. Almost lost my chance because I was so afraid of losing it." "What did you do?" "I learned that fear is useful fuel, but it can't be your only fuel. You need to believe you deserve to be here." Dr. Okonkwo looked directly at Annie. "You were selected because you have something special, not despite your background, but because of it. Your hunger, your resilience, your perspective, that's your advantage." "It doesn't feel like an advantage. It feels like I'm always 5 steps behind everyone else." "People like us don't get doors, Annie." Dr. Okonkwo's voice was firm, powerful. "We break walls. And yes, it's harder. Yes, it's exhausting. But when you break through, you're stronger than anyone who just walked through an open door." Annie stared at her mentor, feeling something shift inside her chest. "You belong here," Dr. Okonkwo continued. "Stop trying to prove it and start believing it. The moment you do, everything changes." That conversation became Annie's turning point. She still worked hard, harder than almost anyone, but she stopped trying to be perfect. She asked questions without shame. She admitted when she didn't know something. She let her classmates see her struggle instead of hiding it. And something unexpected happened. They respected her more, not less. During study groups, they started asking for her perspective. During presentations, they wanted her on their teams. During late-night conversations, they confided in her because she understood what it meant to fight for every inch of progress. Her intelligence, raw, hungry, relentless, began to shine through the fear. In finance class, she dissected market trends with precision that impressed the professors. In technology seminars, she connected dots others missed, seeing opportunities in problems. In strategy workshops, her insights came from lived experience, understanding poor communities, underserved markets, people the financial system ignored. By month 6, Annie Sander was no longer the scared girl hiding in the back of the classroom. She was the woman other scholars came to for advice. And late at night, when she was alone in her room, she'd pull up that old magazine cover of George Cleary on her phone, the one she'd saved months ago. She'd stare at his face and whisper, "You have no idea what's coming." Annie named her company Level Up. The concept was simple, almost painfully so, a fintech platform that gave low-income individuals access to microloans and financial education through a smartphone app. No bank branches. No credit score requirements. No judgment. Just access. The kind of access Annie would have killed for when she was sleeping in that alley, choosing between bus fare and food. "It's personal," she told her co-founder, Marcus Chun, a brilliant programmer from the scholarship program who'd grown up in poverty in rural China. "This isn't just business. This is personal." Marcus nodded, his fingers already flying across his laptop keyboard. Then let's build something that matters. They started in year 2 of the program, using every spare moment outside of classes. Nights, weekends, holidays. Time became a currency they spent ruthlessly on their dream. The work was brutal. Annie's typical day started at 5 a.m. with coursework, classes from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., then level-up development from 5 p.m. until 2 or 3 a.m. Sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford. Friends became a distraction she didn't have time for. Everything, every single thing, went into building this company. "You're going to burn out," Yuki warned her one evening, finding Annie hunched over her laptop in the library at midnight, eyes bloodshot and hands shaking from too much coffee. "I can't afford to burn out," Annie replied, not looking up from the financial projections on her screen. "This has to work." "Why? You could join any company after graduation." "You're brilliant, Annie. You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Annie finally looked up, and something in her eyes made Yuki step back. "I have to prove that people like me, people who come from nothing, can build something that changes the world. Not join someone else's company. Build our own." Yuki studied her for a long moment, then quietly set an energy bar and water bottle on the table. "At least eat something." After she left, Annie stared at the food for a moment, then unwrapped the bar and took a bite. She couldn't afford to burn out. But she also couldn't afford to fail. 6 months into development, Level Up had a working prototype. Annie and Marcus had built a sleek app interface that made applying for a microloan as simple as ordering food. The AI-powered assessment system evaluated applicants based on alternative data, phone payment history, utility bills, rental receipts, instead of traditional credit scores that locked poor people out of the system. It was brilliant. It was revolutionary. Now they just needed money to launch it properly. Dr. Okonkwo connected them with potential investors, venture capitalists who claimed they cared about social impact and financial inclusion. Their first pitch meeting was with Morgan & Associates, a prominent Swiss investment firm. Annie wore her best outfit, a simple black blazer and pants she'd bought from a thrift store, paired with the confidence she'd been building for 18 months. Marcus presented the technical side. Annie presented the vision. She spoke about the 2 billion people locked out of traditional banking. About single mothers who couldn't get small business loans. About workers who turned to predatory payday lenders because banks wouldn't serve them. About a girl who once slept in an alley and would have done anything for access to just $500 to get back on her feet. The lead investor, a middle-aged man named Klaus Werner, listened with his arms crossed. When Annie finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and smiled, the kind of smile that felt like a knife. "Ms. Sander, this is very idealistic. But let's be honest." He gestured at the pitch deck. "You're too young, too inexperienced, and frankly too personally invested. This reads more like a charity than a business." Annie's jaw tightened. "The market size is..." "I know the numbers. But do you know what investors look for? Track record. Credibility. Someone we can trust with millions of dollars." He paused. "You were a cleaner 18 months ago. What makes you think you can run a tech company?" The room went silent. Marcus looked like he wanted to punch something. Annie felt that old shame trying to crawl up her throat, the same shame she'd felt on that rooftop with George, the same shame that said you don't belong here. But this time, she didn't run. She stood taller, looked Klaus Werner directly in the eyes, and said calmly, "You're right. I was a cleaner. I was also homeless. I know what it's like to be locked out of a system that treats poverty like a personal failure instead of a structural problem." Her voice was steady, sharp. "That's not a weakness, Mr. Werner. That's my competitive advantage. I understand this market because I lived it. And when Level Up succeeds, not if, when, you'll regret that you couldn't see past your own bias to recognize a billion-dollar opportunity." She picked up her laptop, nodded to Marcus, and walked out. Her hands didn't start shaking until they reached the elevator. "That was incredible," Marcus said, his voice full of awe. Annie leaned against the elevator wall and closed her eyes. "That was us losing our best shot at funding." "Maybe. But you didn't let him make you small." No, she hadn't. But rejection still hurt. For 2 weeks, they heard nothing from other investors. Annie kept pitching, kept refining, kept pushing, but the answers were always the same. Too risky. Not enough traction. Come back when you have revenue. She was starting to think Klaus Werner was right. Maybe she was too inexperienced. Maybe this was too big a dream for someone like her. Then Dr. Okonkwo called. There's someone I want you to meet. Sophia Ramirez. Tech investor, self-made billionaire. She built 3 companies from scratch. She's in Geneva tomorrow for 1 day only. I got you 30 minutes. Annie's heart raced. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. 2 p.m. Don't be late. Sophia Ramirez was nothing like Klaus Werner. She was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and direct, wearing jeans and a blazer that somehow looked both casual and powerful. She listened to Annie's pitch without interrupting, leaning forward slightly, her attention absolute. When Annie finished, Sophia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell me about the alley." Annie blinked. "What?" "Dr. Okonkwo told me you were homeless before the scholarship. Tell me about it. Not the sanitized version, the real version." Annie glanced at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. So she told her. About George's rejection. About losing everything in one night. About the 3 weeks on the street. About the hunger, the fear, the shame. About applying for the scholarship as a last desperate act. About the rage that kept her going when hope died. Sophia listened without judgment, her expression unreadable. When Annie finished, Sophia leaned back and smiled, but this smile was different. This smile had recognition in it. "You know what I see when I look at you," Sophia said. "Someone too inexperienced to run a tech company?" Annie replied, unable to keep the bitterness out of her voice. "No. I see someone who will die before letting this company fail." Sophia pulled out her phone and typed something. "That's not something you can teach or fake. That's the difference between entrepreneurs who build empires and entrepreneurs who build hobbies." She turned her phone around, showing Annie a wire transfer confirmation. $2 million. Annie's heart stopped. "That's your seed funding," Sophia said simply. $2 million, 15% equity, and I want a board seat. Not because I think you'll succeed, though I do, but because I know what it's like to build something while everyone tells you that you can't. And I refuse to be the person who closes a door on someone with your fire. Annie couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. Marcus made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "One condition," Sophia continued. "You work with my mentorship team. You learn from people who've built what you're trying to build. You don't have to do this alone." Annie found her voice. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Sophia's smile turned sad. "Because 20 years ago, I was you. And someone took a chance on me when no one else would." She stood and extended her hand. "Don't make me regret it." Annie shook her hand, gripping tight. "I won't. I swear I won't." Level Up launched 4 months later. Annie and Marcus worked like people possessed, coding, testing, marketing, pitching, recruiting. Sophia's mentorship team guided them through legal structures, hiring, partnerships with payment processors and mobile networks. The app went live on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday evening, they had 10,000 downloads. By the end of the week, 50,000. The growth was explosive. Word spread through low-income communities like wildfire. Finally, a way to access emergency funds without predatory interest rates. Finally, financial education that didn't talk down to them. Finally, someone who understood. The media took notice. TechCrunch, new fintech startup tackles financial inclusion with innovative microloan platform. Forbes, former homeless woman builds tech company to help the poor access banking. Bloomberg, Level Up raises $2 million, aims to bank the unbanked. But it was the local Geneva newspaper headline that made Annie cry. From cleaner to CEO, scholarship graduate builds company to lift others out of poverty. Annie sat in her tiny apartment, no longer a dorm room, but her own place, staring at the article with her photo next to it. She looked different in the picture. Confident. Powerful. Like someone who mattered. She pulled out her phone and found that old magazine cover of George Cleary, the one she'd been carrying for over a year. Then she opened a new browser tab and searched her own name. Dozens of articles appeared, each one documenting her rise. Annie Sander wasn't a cleaner anymore. She wasn't homeless. She wasn't invisible. She was a CEO. And she was just getting started. The invitation arrived on embossed cream cardstock, the kind of paper that announced its own importance. You are cordially invited to speak at the Global Economic Forum in Davos. Annie ran her fingers over the gold lettering, remembering the girl who once couldn't afford a bus ticket. Now world leaders wanted to hear her speak. She accepted. Davos was everything she'd expected and nothing she'd imagined. The Swiss Alps rose like white giants around the convention center where billionaires, presidents, and CEOs gathered to discuss the future of the global economy. Annie walked through the security checkpoint in a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than her entire wardrobe used to, her heels clicking against marble floors with the confidence of someone who belonged. Because she did belong. 3 years ago, she'd been invisible. Now, people recognized her. Ms. Sander, could we get a photo? Annie, what's your take on the cryptocurrency regulation debate? Ms. Sander, Bloomberg would love an interview. She smiled, nodded, spoke with the ease of someone who'd learned to command rooms instead of clean them. Her keynote speech, Financial Inclusion as Economic Imperative, received a standing ovation from an audience that included 2 former presidents, a dozen Fortune 500 CEOs, and the managing director of the IMF. Afterward, a line formed to speak with her. An investor from Singapore wanted to discuss expansion into Asian markets. A philanthropist from Germany wanted to partner on financial literacy programs. The CEO of a major mobile network wanted to integrate Level Up into their platform. Annie took their cards, scheduled follow-ups, and moved through the crowd like water, smooth, fluid, unstoppable. This was her world now. The awards came in waves that year. Forbes 30 Under 30. She stood on stage in New York, accepting the recognition while cameras flashed and journalists scribbled notes about the former homeless woman turned tech titan. Fast Company's most innovative companies. Level Up ranked number 7, ahead of companies with 10 times their funding and 100 times their history. Time magazine's Next Generation Leaders. Her face on the cover, the headline reading, Annie Sander, Rebuilding Finance from the Ground Up. The UN Financial Inclusion Award. Presented in Geneva by the Secretary General himself, who shook her hand and said, "You're proof that potential exists everywhere, we just need to give people access." Each award was validation. Each keynote speech was proof she mattered. Each magazine feature was another nail in the coffin of the girl George Cleary had dismissed. But Annie's transformation wasn't just professional, it was physical, spatial, gravitational. She walked differently now. Not the hurried head-down shuffle of someone trying to be invisible, but the measured, deliberate stride of someone who knew her presence commanded attention. Her posture was straight, shoulders back, chin level. When she entered a room, conversations paused. When she spoke, people leaned in. She'd learned the language of power, not just business jargon, but the subtle codes of the elite. The right handshake, firm but not aggressive. The right eye contact, direct, confident, slightly challenging. The right wardrobe, elegant, expensive, but never trying too hard. Her signature look became a white blazer and crimson silk blouse, colors that stood out in rooms full of navy suits and corporate gray. Her dark hair, once unkempt and desperate, now fell in styled waves that framed her face perfectly. Her makeup was minimal but precise, enhancing rather than hiding. She looked like royalty. She moved like power. And people treated her accordingly. "You've changed," Marcus told her one evening after a board meeting where she'd negotiated terms with a venture capital firm so skillfully they'd walked away thinking they'd won. "Have I?" Annie asked, reviewing the contract they'd just signed. "You're formidable. It's kind of intimidating, honestly." Annie looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that had sharp edges. "Good. Intimidating means they take me seriously." The wealth came quietly, almost by accident. Level Up's valuation had climbed from $10 million at seed funding to $500 million by year 2 to $1.2 billion by year 3. Annie's equity stake made her, on paper, worth over $400 million. But she didn't touch it. Instead, she built a network of investors who owed her favors, doors that opened when she called, relationships that turned into leverage. She learned from Sophia, from Dr. Okonkwo, from every billionaire and power broker she met that wealth wasn't just about money, it was about access, influence, and the ability to move pieces on the global chessboard. Annie moved pieces carefully. She invested in other women-led startups. She joined boards of organizations focused on poverty alleviation. She quietly donated millions to scholarships for disadvantaged students, paying forward the chance she'd been given. But she also built something else, a war chest. Because Annie Sander hadn't forgotten where she came from. And she hadn't forgotten who put her there. She started tracking Cleary Holdings in year 3. Not obviously. Not publicly. Just quiet monitoring through financial news, stock reports, industry gossip. What she found was fascinating. George Cleary's company, once a darling of Wall Street, was struggling. Nothing catastrophic, but a slow decline that insiders were starting to notice. Missed earnings projections. Failed product launches. Executive turnover. A CEO whose arrogance had started to alienate board members and investors alike. George had made the classic mistake of successful men. He'd started believing his own legend. He'd turned down strategic partnerships because he thought he didn't need them. He'd ignored market shifts because he thought he knew better. He'd surrounded himself with yes-men who wouldn't challenge him because he couldn't tolerate being questioned. Cleary Holdings stock had dropped 23% in 18 months. Annie watched the decline with clinical interest, the way a chess player studies a weakening opponent. Then, one morning over coffee, she made a decision. She called her wealth manager, a discreet man named Thomas who handled the finances of people who preferred their moves stayed private. "Thomas, I want to start buying stock in Cleary Holdings." "The tech company? They've been underperforming." "I know. That's why I'm buying. Small purchases, nothing that triggers reporting requirements. Use shell companies, different brokers, spread it out over time. I want this completely quiet." "May I ask why?" Annie's smile was cold. Long-term strategy. What she didn't say, revenge is a dish best served with majority shareholding. Over the next 8 months, Annie quietly accumulated Cleary Holdings stock. She bought during dips. She bought through third parties. She bought in small enough increments that no one noticed a pattern. Her wealth managers set up a web of LLCs and investment vehicles that made tracking the purchases nearly impossible. 5% ownership. Then 8%. Then 12%. George Cleary had no idea. The board had no idea. The market had no idea. Annie Sander, the former cafeteria cleaner, was slowly, methodically buying the company that had thrown her away. She did this while running Level Up, while giving keynote speeches, while appearing on magazine covers, while building her empire. Because Annie had learned something crucial: power isn't loud. Power is patient. Power is strategic. Power is the ability to make moves no one sees coming until it's too late to stop them. By month 9, she owned 15% of Cleary Holdings. By month 12, 22%. Her advisors started asking questions. "Annie, this is a significant capital allocation. Cleary Holdings is still declining. Are you sure this is wise?" "I'm sure." "What's the end game here?" Annie looked out the window of her Geneva office, the one with floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the lake, the Alps rising majestically in the distance. She thought about the rooftop where George had destroyed her. She thought about the alley where she'd slept on cardboard. She thought about every person who'd told her she didn't belong, that she wasn't enough, that people like her didn't get to sit at the table. "The end game," she said quietly, "is owning the table." The news broke on a Wednesday. Financial Times: Cleary Holdings stock sees unusual buying activity. Wall Street Journal: mystery investor accumulates major stake in struggling tech firm. George Cleary called an emergency board meeting. "Who the hell is buying our stock?" he demanded, slamming the report on the conference table. His CFO, a nervous man named Richard, adjusted his glasses. "We don't know. The purchases are coming through multiple shell companies and investment vehicles. It's been going on for months, but in small enough increments that we didn't catch it until now." "How much do they own?" "Based on what we can trace, approximately 22%. Maybe more. We won't know the exact number until the next required filing." George's jaw tightened. 22% is enough to make serious noise at shareholder meetings. "Find out who it is. I want a name by Friday." Richard nodded and scurried out. George stood at the window of his corner office, looking out at the city skyline, The same skyline he'd looked at 3 years ago when a desperate cafeteria worker had interrupted his evening to confess feelings he'd found laughable. He'd forgotten her name within a week. He had no idea she remembered his. Annie received the news from Thomas while reviewing Level Up's quarterly reports. They know someone's buying. They're investigating. Let them investigate, Annie said calmly. They won't find anything until I want them to. When will that be? Annie looked at her calendar. In 2 weeks, she was scheduled to return to her home city for a tech conference, the first time she'd been back since leaving for Geneva 3 years ago. Soon, she said. Very soon. She ended the call and pulled up a photo on her phone. Not George's magazine cover this time. A photo from last month, Annie on stage at Davos, standing at the podium with world leaders in the audience, commanding the room with the same authority George once had. The girl he'd rejected had become someone he couldn't ignore. And now, she was coming home. The private jet cut through clouds like a knife through silk. Annie sat in the cream leather seat, watching the city emerge below, familiar skyline, recognizable streets, the place that had broken her and tried to bury her. Her fingers traced the rim of her champagne flute, but she hadn't taken a sip. She wanted to be completely clear-headed for this. 3 years. 3 years since she'd left the city as nobody, running from pain and rejection with nothing but a scholarship acceptance email and dreams too fragile to speak aloud. Now she was returning as Annie Sander, CEO Billionaire, Force of Nature. Ms. Sander, we're beginning our descent, the pilot's voice came through the intercom. Landing in 15 minutes. Annie set down the glass and pulled out her phone, checking her reflection in the black screen. Her makeup was perfect, minimal, elegant, powerful. Her hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders. The white suit fit like it was painted on, the crimson silk blouse underneath a deliberate splash of color that said I'm here, and you will notice me. This wasn't an outfit. This was armor. She slipped on her sunglasses, oversized designer, the kind that cost more than her first car, and waited for the wheels to touch down. The moment the cabin door opened, Annie felt it, the weight of attention, the gravity of return. Cameras flashed before she even appeared. She stepped onto the stairs with the practiced grace of someone who'd done this 100 times, shoulders back, chin up, moving like she owned not just the plane but the air itself. Her heels clicked against metal steps, each sound deliberate and sharp. The tarmac was crowded. Airport security held back a cluster of reporters and photographers, all jostling for position, all shouting her name. Ms. Sander. Ms. Sander. Annie. What brings you back to the city? Ms. Sander. Is it true you're the mystery investor in Cleary Holdings? Annie. Will you be meeting with local officials? Ms. Sander. Can you comment on the Forbes article calling you the most influential tech CEO under 30? Annie descended the stairs slowly, deliberately, letting them capture every angle. Her security team, 2 professionals who looked like they could stop a tank, flanked her but stayed back enough to keep her visible. She removed her sunglasses at the bottom of the stairs, making eye contact with the cameras, and smiled, not warm, not friendly, but the smile of someone who knew exactly how powerful she looked. It's wonderful to be home, she said, her voice carrying easily over the noise. This city made me who I am. I'm here for the Tech Innovation Summit, and I'm excited to share what we've built at Level Up with the community that shaped me. Ms. Sander, is it true you were homeless before your success? The question could have been an ambush. 3 years ago, it would have shattered her. Now, Annie's smile sharpened. It's true. I lived in an alley not far from here, actually. Slept on cardboard, wondered if I'd survive to see tomorrow. She paused, letting that sink in. But that experience taught me something crucial. The only difference between the people society gives up on and the people society celebrates is opportunity. I got an opportunity. Level Up exists to give others that same chance. She didn't wait for follow-up questions. She nodded once, replaced her sunglasses, and walked toward the waiting black SUV, a vehicle that screamed money and importance. Behind her, cameras flashed like stars exploding. The drive into the city was surreal. Annie sat in the back of the SUV, watching familiar streets roll past. The diner where she used to work double shifts, the bus stop where she'd slept, the library where she'd applied to the scholarship, the building where Cleary Holdings stood like a monument to the man who'd rejected her. Everything looked the same, but smaller somehow. Or maybe she'd just grown too large for this place. Her phone buzzed constantly. Messages from Marcus, from Sophia, from board members and investors. She ignored most of them, focusing instead on the news alerts that had started flooding in the moment her plane landed. Business Insider: tech mogul Annie Sander returns to hometown in stunning fashion. TechCrunch: Level Up CEO makes triumphant homecoming. Local news: from homeless to billionaire, Annie Sander's incredible return. Social media was exploding. Photos of her arrival already had hundreds of thousands of likes, comments, shares. People who'd never noticed her existence now couldn't stop talking about her. Annie opened Twitter and scrolled through the reactions. She looks like she owns the world. That entrance was iconic. From cleaning tables to commanding boardrooms, this is what resilience looks like. Wait, she's the girl who used to work at Cleary Holdings? George Cleary must be shaking RN. That last comment made Annie smile. Yes, George. I'm back. The news reached George Cleary during a board meeting. Richard, his CFO, had just finished presenting quarterly projections, grim numbers that showed continued decline, when George's assistant knocked on the conference room door. Not now, George snapped. Sir, I think you need to see this. She held up her tablet, showing a news article with a photo that made George's heart stop. A woman in a white suit descending airplane stairs, surrounded by cameras and reporters, radiating the kind of power and presence that made you stop and stare. The headline: Annie Sander returns home. George stood so abruptly his chair scraped across the floor. He took the tablet, staring at the photo, his mind refusing to connect the dots. Annie Sander. The name was familiar, but from where? Who is she? He asked. The Level Up CEO, Richard said carefully. The fintech company. She's been all over the news. I know who Level Up is, George interrupted. Why does her name sound familiar? Richard hesitated. Sir, she used to work here. In the cafeteria. About 3 years ago. The room went silent. George's memory clicked, dragging up a ghost he'd forgotten. A plain girl with desperate eyes, rain-soaked on a rooftop, confessing feelings he'd found embarrassingly inappropriate. What was her name? Annie something? That's impossible, he said. The cafeteria worker, she was nobody. This woman is worth over $400 million, Richard finished. And apparently, she's speaking at the Tech Innovation Summit tomorrow. She's staying at the Lux Grand, and according to social media, half the city is talking about her return. George looked at the photo again, really looked this time. The bone structure was similar. The eyes, maybe. But everything else, the confidence, the power, the sheer presence, was completely different. Could it really be her? Sir, Richard said quietly, there's something else you should know. What? We've been investigating the mystery investor buying our stock. We still don't have confirmation, but there are rumors. He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Say it. Rumors that it might be her. Annie Sander. The tablet slipped from George's hands, clattering onto the conference table. George cancelled the rest of his meetings. He sat alone in his office, scrolling through article after article about Annie Sander, each one more impressive than the last. Forbes covers. UN awards. Keynote speeches at Davos. A company valued at over $1 billion. An influence that reached across continents. This couldn't be the same girl. But the older photos confirmed it, before and after images that showed the transformation from unremarkable cafeteria worker to global business leader. She'd been nobody. Now she was somebody. And if the rumors were true, if she was the mystery investor buying Cleary Holdings stock, George's hands tightened into fists. Why? Why would she come after his company? Was this revenge? Some twisted payback for a rejection that happened 3 years ago? He pulled up his calendar. The Tech Innovation Summit was tomorrow. She was the keynote speaker. He could go. He could confront her, ask her directly what she wanted. Or he could do nothing, let this blow over, refuse to give her the satisfaction of knowing he was rattled. But he was rattled. George Cleary, billionaire CEO, man who'd built an empire through confidence and control, felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Across the city, in the penthouse suite of the Lux Grand Hotel, Annie stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline. She'd ordered room service, expensive food she barely touched, too focused on the view, on the lights, on the city spread out below her like a game board. Somewhere out there, George Cleary was hearing her name. Somewhere out there, he was realizing that the girl he'd dismissed had returned. Somewhere out there, he was starting to understand that he'd made a mistake. Annie's phone buzzed with a message from Thomas. Media coverage exceeding expectations. Stock purchases still undetected. Ready to proceed to next phase. She typed back, "Yes. It's time." She set down the phone and allowed herself a small smile. Tomorrow, she'd give her keynote speech at the summit. Tomorrow, the city would remember her name. And tomorrow, George Cleary would start to realize that the rooftop conversation 3 years ago hadn't been the end of their story. It had been the beginning. Annie picked up her champagne glass, the one she'd been saving, and raised it toward the city lights. "To second chances," she whispered to her reflection in the window. "And to the people who underestimate us." She took a sip, feeling the bubbles dance on her tongue, tasting like victory. Then she turned away from the view and opened her laptop. She had a speech to finalize. And a CEO to destroy. Dawn broke over the city in shades of gold and amber, painting the glass skyscrapers with light that made them look like they were on fire. The Cleary Holdings boardroom occupied the 42nd floor, a vast space of polished marble, leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view most people would never see. The sunrise reflected off the glass conference table, creating patterns of light that danced across the faces of the 8 board members who sat waiting. George Cleary stood at the head of the table, hands braced on the surface, looking out at the city he'd once conquered. He hadn't slept. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his tie was slightly crooked, details that would have been unthinkable a week ago. "Let's begin," he said, his voice tight. "Richard, what do we know about the mystery investor?" Richard cleared his throat nervously, adjusting papers that didn't need adjusting. "Sir, we've traced the purchases through multiple shell companies and offshore accounts. The pattern suggests someone with significant resources and legal expertise deliberately hiding their identity." "How much do they own now?" "Based on our latest analysis, approximately 28%, possibly more. We won't have exact numbers until the mandatory filing, but..." The boardroom doors opened. Every head turned. Annie Sander walked in. She wore the white suit and crimson blouse from yesterday's arrival, her hair falling in perfect waves, her heels clicking against marble with the rhythm of inevitability. Behind her, 2 lawyers in dark suits carried briefcases, their expressions professionally neutral. The room erupted. Gasps. Whispers. Board members leaning toward each other, confusion and shock rippling through the space like electricity. George's face went white. He stood frozen, hands still braced on the table, staring at the woman who'd just entered his boardroom like she owned it. Because, Annie thought with cold satisfaction, she almost did. "Good morning," Annie said, her voice cutting through the whispers with surgical precision. "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe this conversation concerns me." "What?" George's voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tried again. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here for the board meeting." Annie walked to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table, the one traditionally reserved for major shareholders, and sat down with the easy confidence of someone who belonged. "I am, after all, significantly invested in this company's future." One of the board members, an older woman named Margaret Chun who'd served on the board for 15 years, leaned forward. "Ms. Sander, while we're certainly aware of your impressive career, I'm not sure what gives you the right to." 28.3%, Annie interrupted smoothly. "That's exactly how much of Cleary Holdings I own as of this morning. Which makes me the largest single shareholder of this company." Silence. Absolute, crushing silence. Richard's face went from confused to comprehending to horrified in the span of 3 seconds. You're the mystery investor?" "Mystery investor sounds so dramatic." Annie smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I prefer strategic stakeholder. And before anyone asks, yes, every purchase was legal, properly documented, and conducted through legitimate channels. My lawyers have prepared the necessary filings, which will be submitted to the SEC within the hour." She nodded to one of her lawyers, who began distributing folders to each board member. Margaret opened hers, scanned the contents, and looked up with something like awe. "This is comprehensive. The shell companies, the transaction history, the timeline." She looked at Annie with new respect. How long have you been planning this? Long enough, Annie replied. George finally found his voice. This is absurd. You can't you're not, he struggled for words, his usual eloquence abandoned. You worked in the cafeteria 3 years ago. You have no business being in this boardroom. Didn't I hear you give a speech once about meritocracy? Annie's tone was pleasant, conversational, lethal. About how anyone with talent and drive could succeed in America. Or did you mean anyone except the people who clean your floors? Another board member, James Park, a venture capitalist who'd invested early in Cleary Holdings, laughed suddenly. I'll be damned. You're the Annie Sander. Level Up founder. Forbes cover. I heard your Davos speech last year. It was brilliant. He looked at George with barely concealed amusement. You didn't recognize her? George's jaw worked, but no sound came out. To be fair, Annie said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, I looked different back then. Poverty and homelessness don't exactly bring out one's best features. But a scholarship, education, opportunity, turns out that changes things. She stood, walking slowly around the table, her fingers trailing along the leather chairs as she moved. Every board member watched her, transfixed. Here's what's going to happen, Annie continued, her voice calm and absolute. As the majority shareholder, I'm calling for a vote of no confidence in current leadership. I'm proposing a complete restructuring of the executive team, starting with the CEO position. And I'm recommending myself for the board of directors, where I can ensure this company stops hemorrhaging value due to arrogance and short-sighted decision-making. Margaret flipped through more pages. Your proposals are detailed. Alternative strategies, market analysis, projected growth scenarios. She looked up. This is actually quite sound. Cleary Holdings has been declining for 18 months. Your approach could reverse that. Of course it could, Annie said simply. I don't make moves I haven't thought through. This is a coup, George said, his voice rising. You're trying to steal my company. Your company? Annie stopped walking, turning to face him directly across the length of the table. The sunrise behind her cast her in silhouette, making her look larger than life. You mean the publicly traded company where you own 18% of shares? The company whose stock I legally purchased on the open market? That company. Why? The word burst from George like a wound opening. Why are you doing this, Annie? The use of her first name, intimate, desperate, made something flicker across Annie's face. For just a moment, the armor cracked, and the board members saw not the powerful CEO but the girl who'd once confessed her feelings on a rooftop. Then the armor sealed again. You really want to know? Annie's voice was quiet now, more dangerous than when she'd been loud. She walked toward George slowly, deliberately, until she stood across the table from him. 3 years ago, I stood in the rain and told you I had feelings for you. Do you remember what you said? George said nothing, but his face had gone pale. You said, we're from different worlds. You're not for my world. Annie paused, letting the words hang in the air. That night I lost you, though I never really had you. I lost my job. I lost my apartment. I lost everything. Her voice didn't shake, didn't break. It was steady as steel. I slept in an alley for 3 weeks, George. I starved. I wondered if I should just give up, if maybe you were right and I really didn't belong anywhere. She leaned forward slightly. But then I realized something. You were right, I didn't belong in your world. She smiled, and it was the most dangerous smile anyone in that room had ever seen. So I built my own. A world where people like me aren't dismissed because we started with nothing. A world where your background doesn't determine your worth. A world where talent matters more than your last name or your bank account. Annie straightened, her voice gaining power. You taught me the world didn't want me. So I built my own. And now, that world is big enough to swallow yours whole. The boardroom was absolutely silent. George stared at her, and for the first time he really saw her, not the cafeteria worker, not the desperate girl on the rooftop, but the woman she'd become. Powerful, brilliant, unstoppable, and coming for everything he'd built. The vote, Margaret said quietly, breaking the silence. We should vote on Ms. Sanders' proposals. All in favor of adding Annie Sander to the board of directors, James said, raising his hand immediately. One by one, hands rose around the table. Margaret. James. David Wong. Patricia Alvarez. Robert Kim. Even Richard, after a long moment, raised his hand. 7 votes. Only George's hand remained down. Motion passes, Margaret announced. Welcome to the board, Ms. Sander. The board members began to applaud, slowly at first, then louder, the sound filling the glass room and echoing off the windows. Annie stood perfectly still, accepting their recognition with a slight nod, her face composed. Only George remained frozen, his world crumbling in real time. This meeting is adjourned, Margaret said, standing. We'll reconvene tomorrow to discuss the restructuring proposals in detail. The board members filed out, several pausing to shake Annie's hand or congratulate her. Brilliant strategy, David murmured. We've needed fresh leadership for months, Patricia whispered. Soon, only Annie and George remained. The sunrise had fully broken now, flooding the room with harsh morning light that made everything too bright, too exposed. You destroyed me, George said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. No, Annie replied calmly. I saved you. This company was dying under your leadership. Your arrogance was driving it into the ground. I'm giving it a chance to survive. She picked up her briefcase. But if you're asking if this was also revenge? If part of me enjoyed watching you realize that the girl you dismissed is now your superior? She walked toward the door, then paused and looked back. Yes, George. Yes, I did. Annie Sander walked out of the boardroom, leaving George Cleary standing alone in the ruins of his empire, the sunrise at his back looking less like hope and more like a fire consuming everything he'd built. Annie stood in her hotel suite, watching the city lights flicker to life as evening settled over the skyline. A glass of wine sat untouched on the table beside her. She'd ordered it for celebration, but found she didn't feel like celebrating. She felt empty. The victory had been sweet in the boardroom, undeniable and public. But now, alone with the silence, Annie wondered why it didn't feel the way she'd imagined. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It's George. Can we talk? Please. Just 5 minutes. Annie stared at the message for a long moment. She could ignore it. Block the number. Let him suffer in uncertainty the way she'd suffered in that alley. But that would be the old Annie, the one who ran from pain, who let hurt fester into bitterness. The new Annie faced things head-on. She typed back, Rooftop Garden. Hotel Lux Grand. 8 p.m. Come alone. The rooftop garden was beautiful at night, strings of lights woven through greenery, comfortable seating areas, a view of the city that stretched for miles. Annie had chosen it deliberately. Not a boardroom. Not his territory. Neutral ground where they could speak as equals. Or as close to equals as they'd ever be again. She arrived early, wearing jeans and a simple black sweater, no armor tonight, no power suit. Just Annie. She sat on a bench overlooking the city, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. George appeared exactly at 8. He looked different than he had that morning, smaller somehow, even though his physical size hadn't changed. He wore casual clothes too, which surprised her. No suit, no tie. Just a gray sweater and dark pants, like he was trying to shed the CEO persona and be just. George. Thank you for meeting me, he said, stopping a few feet away, uncertain if he should sit. Sit down, George. I'm not going to bite. He sat at the opposite end of the bench, maintaining distance like he was afraid to get too close. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city hummed below, oblivious to the conversation unfolding above it. I don't know where to start, George finally said. The beginning usually works, Annie replied, her tone neutral. George laughed, a bitter, broken sound. The beginning. That would be the rooftop, wouldn't it? That night when you... He trailed off. When I told you I had feelings for you, and you rejected me like I was trash. He flinched. I wasn't trying to, he stopped, started again. I was cruel. There's no excuse for how I spoke to you that night. No, there isn't. I've been thinking about it constantly since you walked into that boardroom. Replaying the conversation, remembering the way you looked at me, the way I... He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. I was so arrogant. So convinced that your feelings were inappropriate, that you didn't understand how different our worlds were. You were right, Annie said quietly. Our worlds were different. George looked at her, surprised. You had money, power, education, connections. I had nothing but hope and hunger. We weren't the same. Annie turned to face him fully. But where you were wrong, where you were devastatingly, cruelly wrong, was thinking that made me less valuable as a human being. I know, George whispered. God, Annie, I know. And if I had known who you would become. Stop. The word was sharp, cutting through his confession like a blade. Annie stood up, needing distance, needing space to breathe. She walked to the edge of the rooftop, gripping the railing, staring out at the city that had rejected her and now celebrated her. Don't finish that sentence, she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Don't you dare finish that sentence. George stood too, taking a step toward her but not closing the distance completely. What do you mean? Annie turned to face him, and George saw something in her eyes that made him take a step back. Not anger exactly, but something deeper, more fundamental. Disappointment. If you had known who I would become, Annie said slowly, deliberately, you would have treated me differently. That's what you were going to say, wasn't it? If you'd known I'd be successful, rich, powerful, if you'd known I'd matter someday, you would have been kinder to me. Yes. I suppose that's what I meant. That's exactly the problem, George. Annie's voice wasn't loud, wasn't harsh. It was almost gentle, which somehow made it cut deeper. You're still thinking about people based on their value to you. Their status. Their potential usefulness. She walked back toward him, and George stood frozen as she approached, not threatening, just present, just real. You should treat people based on who they can become, Annie said softly. Not who they are, not what they've achieved, but who they have the potential to be. Every person you meet, the cleaner, the cafeteria worker, the homeless person on the street, they all have potential. They all deserve basic dignity, basic kindness, basic respect. I understand that now, George said, his voice breaking slightly. Watching you these past few days, seeing what you've accomplished, realizing what I missed. You're still not hearing me. Annie shook her head. It shouldn't have taken my success for you to realize you were wrong. I deserved your respect 3 years ago when I was nobody. I deserved kindness when I was cleaning tables. I deserved basic human decency when I stood on that rooftop, vulnerable and hopeful and terrified. George's eyes were wet now. You're right. You're absolutely right. I know I am. Annie took a breath, steadying herself. But here's what I've learned in the past 3 years, George. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I was furious with you for so long. That fury fueled me, pushed me, made me work harder than anyone else. But now that I'm here, now that I've proven everything I needed to prove, I realize that anger doesn't serve me anymore. She sat back down on the bench, suddenly tired. George sat beside her, keeping that careful distance, and waited. I forgive you, Annie said finally. The words hung in the air like something fragile and precious. George stared at her. What? I forgive you for how you treated me. I forgive you for not seeing my worth. I forgive you for being a man so trapped in your own privilege that you couldn't recognize humanity outside your circle. Annie looked at him directly. I forgive you because holding on to what you did to me means you still have power over me. And George, you don't get to have that anymore. A tear slid down George's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. I don't deserve your forgiveness, he whispered. Probably not, Annie agreed. But I'm not giving it to you for your sake. I'm giving it to me for mine. I'm letting go of the girl who needed your validation. I'm letting go of the pain that shaped me. I'm letting go of you. She stood up, preparing to leave. Annie, wait. George stood too. What happens now? With the company, with everything? Annie smiled, and this time it was genuine, warm even. Now? You step down as CEO. The board already knows it's coming. You'll stay on as a consultant if you want, but your time leading that company is over. Not because I want revenge, but because you've proven you're not capable of leading it forward. And you'll take over? Me? No. I have my own company to run. But I'll help find someone who can turn Cleary Holdings around. Someone with vision, humility, and the ability to see potential in everyone. She paused. Someone who won't make the same mistakes you did. George nodded slowly, accepting the truth of it. For what it's worth, I am sorry. Deeply, genuinely sorry. I know you are, Annie said. And maybe that's enough. She started walking toward the exit, then stopped and looked back one more time. George? Do you want to know the real difference between us? What? You had doors opened for you your entire life. Family money, connections, opportunities handed to you before you even knew to ask for them. And you still couldn't see the value in someone who had to fight for every inch. Annie's smile turned sad. I had to break through walls just to get to the doors. And now I'm the one opening them for others. She let that sit for a moment, watching understanding dawn in his eyes. That's the world I built, Annie continued. One where potential matters more than privilege. Where people are measured by their character, not their circumstances. Where someone like the girl I used to be can not only survive but thrive. She tilted her head slightly. You taught me I didn't belong in your world, George. Thank you for that. Because it forced me to build something better. Annie walked away then, her footsteps steady and sure, leaving George alone on the rooftop with his regrets and his recognition that he'd lost something irreplaceable, not Annie's love, which he'd never really had, but the chance to be part of something transformative. At the elevator, Annie paused and pulled out her phone. She scrolled to that old magazine cover of George, the one she'd been carrying for 3 years, the one that had fueled her through the darkest moments. She looked at it one final time. Then she deleted it. The elevator doors closed, and Annie descended back into her life, a life full of purpose, power, and possibility. A life built not on bitterness, but on belief that everyone deserved a chance. Behind her, on the rooftop, George Cleary sat on the bench and cried, not for what he'd lost, but for what he'd never had the wisdom to see when it stood right in front of him. The announcement came on a Monday morning that felt like the world shifting on its axis. Press release. Annie Sander named chairwoman of Cleary Holdings board. The news broke at 9 a.m. sharp, coordinated across every major financial outlet simultaneously. By 9:15, it was trending on Twitter. By 9:30, CNBC had interrupted regular programming for breaking coverage. By 10 a.m., the world knew. Annie Sander, former cafeteria cleaner, former homeless woman, self-made billionaire, now controlled the company that had once thrown her away. George Cleary had officially stepped down as CEO, accepting a non-executive advisory position that was, everyone understood, a polite way of saying he'd been removed from power. The board had voted unanimously for Annie's appointment as chairwoman, with several members privately expressing that it was the best decision the company had made in years. We need vision, Margaret Chun had said during the closed-door vote. We need someone who understands disruption, innovation, and most importantly, humanity. Annie Sander is that person. No one had disagreed. Not even George. The press conference was scheduled for 2 p.m. at Cleary Holdings headquarters, the same building where Annie had once scrubbed tables and refilled coffee cups, invisible to everyone who mattered. Now, she stood in the executive suite on the 42nd floor, looking at herself in the full-length mirror. White suit. Crimson silk blouse. Hair styled in loose waves. Minimal makeup that enhanced rather than masked. Diamond studs in her ears, a gift from Sophia that cost more than Annie's entire first-year salary had been. But it wasn't the clothes or the jewelry that made her look powerful. It was the way she stood. The way she held her head. The certainty in her eyes that said I belong here, and no one can tell me otherwise. Ready? Marcus asked from the doorway. He'd flown in from Geneva specifically for this moment, refusing to miss what he called the greatest comeback story in business history. Ready, Annie confirmed. They walked to the elevator together, descending from the executive floor to the main lobby where the press conference would be held. With each floor that passed, Annie felt the weight of what was about to happen settling over her shoulders. Not a burden. A crown. The lobby had been transformed into a media circus. Reporters packed every available space, major networks, financial publications, tech blogs, international press. Camera crews jostled for position. Photographers tested their flashes. The energy was electric, almost overwhelming. Annie's security team cleared a path, but she could feel the attention like a physical force as she walked toward the podium at the front of the room. Every eye tracked her movement. Every camera followed her progress. She reached the podium, placed her notes down, though she wouldn't need them, she'd memorized every word, and looked out at the sea of faces waiting for her to speak. For just a moment, she flashed back to 3 years ago, standing in this same lobby, soaked from rain, clutching a termination letter, feeling like the smallest person in the world. The memory didn't hurt anymore. It fueled her. "Good afternoon," Annie began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "Thank you all for being here. I know you have questions, and I'll answer them. But first, I want to tell you a story." The room quieted, anticipation rippling through the crowd. 3 years ago, I worked in the cafeteria of this building. I cleaned tables, washed dishes, and tried to be invisible because I knew that people who looked like me, people from where I came from, weren't supposed to dream of anything more. She paused, letting that sink in. One night, I made the mistake of believing I could be seen as more than my job title. I was wrong. I lost everything that night: my hope, my job, my home. The reporters were completely silent now, hanging on every word. I spent 3 weeks homeless, sleeping in alleys, starving, wondering if I should just give up. Annie's voice remained steady, powerful. But then I got a chance, a scholarship that saw potential where others saw poverty. And I made a promise to myself: if I ever got the opportunity, I would make sure no one else had to beg for the basic dignity I was denied. She looked directly at the cameras. "Today, as chairwoman of Cleary Holdings, I'm keeping that promise. This company will no longer operate with the arrogance that nearly destroyed it. We will lead with vision, innovation, and most importantly, humanity. We will remember that every person, regardless of their current circumstances, deserves respect and opportunity." The room erupted with questions, hands shooting up, voices overlapping. "Ms. Sander, is this revenge against George Cleary?" "Annie, what's your first priority as chairwoman?" "Ms. Sander, how does it feel to return to power in a company that rejected you?" Annie held up one hand, and the room quieted. "This isn't about revenge," she said firmly. "This is about transformation. George Cleary taught me an important lesson: that people judge you based on where you are, not where you could be. I'm here to prove that's wrong. I'm here to build a company culture that sees potential everywhere, that invests in people, that understands business success and social responsibility aren't mutually exclusive." "What about George Cleary?" another reporter called out. "What happens to him?" "Mr. Cleary has stepped down as CEO and will serve in an advisory capacity if he chooses. I wish him well." Annie's tone was gracious, final. "Next question." The conference continued for another 30 minutes. Questions about strategy, about Level Up's integration possibilities, about her vision for Cleary Holdings' future. Annie answered each one with confidence and clarity, demonstrating exactly why the board had chosen her. When it ended, she stepped away from the podium to a thunder of camera flashes that felt like starlight exploding. Annie walked through the crowd, her security team creating space but not shielding her completely. She wanted to be visible. She wanted them to see her. Photographers called her name, flashes popping like small supernovas. "Annie, over here. Ms. Sander, look this way. Annie, one more shot." She paused, turned, let them capture the moment. The woman in the white suit and crimson blouse, standing in the lobby where she'd once been invisible, now impossible to ignore. Then she walked out the doors into the afternoon sunlight, and the city that had once rejected her felt different. It felt like home. That evening, Annie made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to the Global Women's Empowerment Foundation. "I want to establish a fund," she told the director. "The Annie Sander Scholarship for Displaced Youth. Full ride for 100 students per year. Focus on women from homeless backgrounds, poverty, foster care, anyone who's been told they don't belong." The director gasped. "Annie, that would be, how much are we talking about?" "I'm committing $50 million to start, with annual contributions to sustain it indefinitely." Silence on the other end. "Then, you're going to change hundreds of lives." "Thousands," Annie corrected. "Over time, thousands." The second call was to a real estate developer. "I want to buy the building at 847 Morrison Street," Annie said. "The one with the grocery store that shut down. That property's been abandoned for years. What do you want it for?" Annie smiled. I'm going to turn it into a community center. Free financial literacy classes, job training, mental health services, and temporary housing assistance. For people who need a chance. That's quite an undertaking. I know. That's why I'm doing it. The third call was to Marcus. How would you feel about opening a level-up office here? She asked. Make this city our North American headquarters? I thought you hated that place, Marcus said, surprised. I did. But pain has a way of becoming purpose if you let it. Annie looked out her hotel window at the city lights. This is where I fell. It's fitting that it's where I build something that catches others. You're incredible, you know that? I'm just someone who got a chance and refuses to waste it. 6 months later, Annie stood on a stage at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Morrison Street Community Center. Local officials flanked her. News crews recorded every moment. But the faces that mattered most were in the audience. Young people from homeless shelters, single mothers struggling to make ends meet, teenagers who'd aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. People who looked like Annie had looked 3 years ago. This center exists because I know what it's like to have nothing, Annie told them, her voice carrying across the crowd. I know what it's like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be told you don't matter. But I also know what's possible when someone believes in you, when someone gives you tools instead of judgment, opportunity instead of pity. She pointed to the building behind her, its fresh paint gleaming in the sunlight. This is your space. Your chance. Your beginning. What you do with it is up to you, but know this, you are not alone anymore. You are not invisible. You matter. The applause was thunderous. Later, a young woman approached Annie, maybe 19, wearing worn clothes and carrying everything she owned in a backpack. Ms. Sander? I just wanted to say thank you. I've been sleeping at a bus station for 2 weeks, and today I enrolled in the job training program. This is the first hope I've felt in months. Annie looked at her and saw herself, scared, desperate, clinging to the possibility that life could be different. What's your name? Annie asked. Maria. Maria, you're going to do incredible things. I know it. Annie pulled out a business card, wrote her personal email on the back. If you ever need anything, advice, support, someone to talk to, reach out. I mean it. Maria stared at the card like it was made of gold. You really mean that? I really do. Annie squeezed her hand. You're not alone in this. As Maria walked away clutching the card, Annie felt something settle inside her chest, a sense of completion, of purpose, of the pain finally transforming into something beautiful. That night, Annie stood alone on the rooftop of her hotel, looking out at the city that had tried to destroy her and failed. She thought about the girl who'd stood on a different rooftop 3 years ago, heartbroken and desperate, believing she was nothing. She thought about the journey from that moment to this one, the hunger, the struggle, the transformation that had seemed impossible but happened anyway. She thought about George, wherever he was, hopefully learning to see people differently. She thought about Maria, about the 100 scholarship students, about the thousands of people Level Up served, about every person who'd been told they didn't belong. And Annie smiled, not with bitterness or revenge, but with something deeper. Satisfaction. Purpose. Peace. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to Sophia. I finally understand what you meant about breaking walls. It's not about destroying them. It's about creating doors for everyone who comes after. Sophia replied immediately, now you're ready to change the world. Annie looked up at the stars, at the vast sky that stretched infinitely above the city, full of possibilities she was only beginning to explore. They once called her nothing. They once called her insignificant, inappropriate, not for their world. Now they called her chairwoman, CEO, billionaire, philanthropist, leader. But the title Annie loved most was the one whispered in homeless shelters and community centers and scholarship programs around the world, spoken by people who saw themselves in her story. Unstoppable. Annie Sander was unstoppable. And she was just getting started.
And that, my beautiful family, is how a woman the world called nothing became everything the world couldn't ignore. Annie Sanders lost her job, her home, and her dignity in one brutal night, rejected by a man who measured worth in dollar signs and dismissed her like dust. But while George Cleary built empires of glass, Annie built herself from the ground up, not with bitterness, but with brilliance. She didn't just survive homelessness. She transformed it into hunger that fueled a billion-dollar dream. She learned that doors closed in your face aren't walls. They're invitations to build your own empire with bigger, better doors that swing open for everyone behind you. George taught her she didn't belong in his world, so she created one so powerful it swallowed his whole. This isn't just a revenge story. It's a resurrection story. It's proof that your worst moment can become your greatest motivation, that rejection is redirection, and that the people who underestimate you today will be studying your success story tomorrow. So if you've ever been told you're not good enough, not smart enough, not worthy enough, remember Annie. Remember that 3 years can turn invisible into unstoppable. Remember that your value isn't determined by those who refuse to see it. If this story lit a fire in your soul, click subscribe, type "I am unstoppable" in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. Because stories like this, stories of falling, rising, and redefining power, remind us that our darkest chapters can become our greatest testimonies. Until next time, this is Mr. Crown Stories, reminding you, you are seen, you are powerful, and you are the comeback story the world needs to witness.